it's quite a the story is already complex enough. I don't know that the midrash, you need the midrashic levels, but I do want to tell you that the sexuality of this and the kind of the undertones of vengeance because of his wife being taken away and the tit for tat chain of events where one thing leads to another thing leads to another thing, that it's all these decisions that end up getting us to this. Again, what kind of makes it a Greek tragedy, this is already a huge part of the Samson story. So where we left off with Samson, he goes crazy after they kill them, and he says he smote them with hip and thigh with great slaughter, and then he went and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Yeah. And so he goes into hiding, essentially. He kills more people, and he also, by the way, says, as soon as I kill you guys some more, then I'll be done. Like, I have a little bit more vengeance. He says, after that, I will cease, which seems to me to be like, I've just got to get this out of my system. I got to do a little vengeance here. Okay, well, that's where we left off. Now, that, of course, you already know without knowing the story, that's not the way it's going to end. But it's interesting that there was a point where Samson said, I've killed enough. So what he said is essentially says, I've done enough. And he says,
still going back to Judas, if I may, Judas' comment, I kind of was leaning in that direction as well, that, the takeaway I got from the whole, story, and I'm sure there's more to it than I, read in when I read it, way back, was that, Samson was obviously very strong in a physical sense, but he lacked moral strength. And I kind of take away, whether it was lust that caused him to go after Delilah, or his reaction to, that they try to take away his wife and he burnt down the fields. It's like everything he did was reactive. And the message I kind of got is, free will is kind of like fire. You can use it for good, and you can use it for, for not so good. And that's kind of what I saw with Samson. He obviously, a icon in the Bible, but I was never determined. He never seemed to come across as a hero, because a hero, is much stronger in terms of their inner strength and their sense of purpose and good. And that's just not something Samson was ever able to develop. So I kind of saw in him, a lot of, maybe all of us, like what's going on today. So just thought I'd.
Well, it's an interesting thing to put out there to think about. I will tell you too, remember, this is a guy who doesn't really have a choice with what happens to him from the very beginning. His destiny is to be a Nazarite. He didn't choose to be a Nazarite. He's born into it, which is unheard of. Like, we don't know any other Nazarites who are Nazarites from birth, who don't have a choice. So he is, to some extent, God sets him apart from the beginning. And of course, his hair being the source of his strength, we actually haven't heard that yet. We know it because we've seen the movies, but the Bible hasn't actually told us that yet. It hasn't told us that. It's interesting that we haven't actually heard that yet. I mean, kind of keep that in mind. So he's just killed a bunch more Philistines. And now, as we're continuing in verse 10, I do want to say that we actually had an opportunity last week, and I didn't realize it until afterwards, to wish Gail a happy birthday. It was her birthday last Tuesday, and we did not wish Gail a happy birthday. So Gail, happy birthday. I mean, I wished you a happy birthday after I realized it, but everybody else, please wish Gail a happy birthday a week later, but definitely we're all here to wish her a happy birthday. So thank you, everybody, for wishing Gail a happy birthday. There she is right there. Happy birthday, Gail. So anyways, we are going to be reading now the conclusion of this story. Rosemary, would you like to continue?
Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah and ranged themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why are you come up against us?" And they answered, "To bind Samson are we come up, so to do to him as he has done to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the cleft of the rock Etam and said to Samson, "Know you not that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them."
So hopefully everybody just saw what happened, because we forget about this part of the story in Samson. It's a disturbing part of the story. It reminds us of what happens when a group of people are powerless to essentially defend themselves. And that when somebody does strike a blow, that even if they survive, if they go back to their own people, they're not safe. He didn't exactly go back to his people, but he's living amongst them. Well, he's living in a cave. He's living in hiding amongst them. He's living, remember, he's from the tribe of Dan, but he's living, he's gone into Judah territory. And so the Philistines come to the tribe of Judah, and specifically to this area, and say, "You've got Samson there. You better turn him over." And so they basically say, "You turn over your own guy, your own hero." And so the Judites go to Samson and they say, "Don't you know you can't mess with the Philistines? Why did you do this?" And Samson says, I got back at them. They hurt me and I hurt them." It's a really disturbing scene, because it's one of, and it's been played out a lot, which is when you are at a disadvantage, the tragedy of the story is that the Israelites can't even defend themselves or their heroes. Here's their hero, killed a lot of Philistines. He's a liberator. But now the Philistines have come and said, "Turn him over." This is a part of the story that people don't remember. Let's see how it plays out.
And they said to him, "We have come down to bind you, that we may deliver you into the hands of the Philistines." And Samson said so to them, "Swear to me that you will not fall upon me yourselves." And they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will bind you fast and deliver you into their hand, but surely we will not kill you." And they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock.
So binding Samson is obviously going to be an important part of the story. It's part of the foreshadowing of this story. Binding Samson, right? If you can bind him, assumedly you can control him. And as we know, that's not the case. You can't really bind Samson. But Samson says to the other Israelites, you can bind me, but just don't hurt me. Don't try to kill me. So what's Samson actually saying to them, right? I'll go with you. You can turn me over, but don't do anything to me. So
does he know that he can break the bonds?
He seems to know that, right? He seems to know that they can't bind, nobody can bind him. But there does seem to be this interesting question here, which is there's really only 2 possibilities why Samson tells them, "Don't hurt me." Number one, they can in fact hurt him. That his power only comes when he's killing. He can hurt Philistines, but he can't hurt his own people.
Kill Philistines, but not Jews.
Yeah, Jews are his kryptonite.
Right.
Women seem to be his kryptonite too, but definitely Jews are his kryptonite, or it could be his kryptonite. That's one possibility. The other possibility is he doesn't want to kill them. There's only really 2 possibilities: is that he doesn't want to hurt them, or he doesn't want them to hurt him, and they in fact could hurt him. So those are really the only 2 possibilities that exist when he tells them, "Fine, you can take me, but don't hurt me. Don't try and hurt me." So, essentially this is a level of,
Don't make the Hulk angry.
and there definitely seems to be that idea, by the way, Rosemary, that he is more of the Hulk than he is
Yeah,
somebody like Captain America, who's always
right.
strong, that he actually has to go to a certain place in order to get angry and get strong, where the power of the Lord comes into him and he becomes the superhero. But this is really strange because we forget about this part, this level of being bound and being taken by his own people. So there is a moment in time, whatever you want to say, what could have happened in this story. At this moment, when the Philistines come to the people and say, turn Samson over, they feel at this point that there's nothing they can do other than get him, which is, number one, an emasculating and humiliating moment for the Israelites to say, we got to turn over our liberator. We got to turn over our superhero. But what would have happened at that moment if 3,000 Judites decided to fight against the Philistines? Was this a moment for them to actually prove themselves and for the story to be a different outcome, for the story to have a different outcome? At this moment, when the people come humiliated and say, Samson, you're coming with us and we're turning you over, was this a moment where the story could have gone a different direction? It is what it is, my friends, because they did it. They took him and they brought him down. In that moment, that must have been a deeply humiliating moment for everybody, for Samson, for the Israelites. This is forgotten in the story, but it's a very powerful moment.
And when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands melted from off his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put out his hand and took it, and slew 1,000 men with it. And Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jaw of an ass, I have slain 1,000 men. And it came to pass, when he'd made an end of speaking, that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand and called that place Ramat Lehi.
Right, which is the next point where he has the superhuman strength that, again, according to this, he kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. That's that this is what happens when again, as it says, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. It's the word again, Ruach Adonai. The Spirit of God comes over him. He becomes like the incredible Hulk. So it means the heights of Lehi. That's what it's called. It's called the mount or the hill of Lehi. But
my very liberal text says Jawbone Hill.
yeah, and that is the play on words, right? Because the place we were told immediately is according to this, he was already at a place called Lehi. Lehi is the place that he's at. According to this, he calls the place Ramat Lehi because it's the place where he kind of names it that, because it becomes Jawbone Hill. Is that why it's called that? It's a place in Judah that, again, according to tradition, is where he went crazy against the Philistines. It's most likely a play on words, because according to this, the place was already called Lehi. And so we're not sure really which came first, but there's definitely a play on this place, Lehi, right? So again, it was already called that, at least according to what was there. The interesting thing is that, okay, he didn't kill him with, I mean, he killed him literally with a jawbone of an ass. There seems to be, again, that seems to be an important part of the story, is that he didn't kill him with a weapon. He didn't have a normal, he didn't have a spear or a hammer, war hammer, any of those kinds of things that are normal implements of war. He kills him with a jawbone of an ass, which is assumedly, again, I guess you could use it as a weapon, but it's not what you normally would use as a weapon. So again, it's partly to explain why this place is called the place of the Jawbone Hill. But the rabbis are fascinated by the fact that it's a jawbone of an ass. Like, what's the significance of this happening here? Right. And so there's an interesting midrash that this ass is none other than the ass of Balaam, the talking donkey, the talking ass who talked to Balaam and told him to stop doing what he's doing because there's an angel right in front of you telling you not to go and curse the Israelites. Now, why, according to the midrash, is this jawbone still there? Because it's a magical jawbone that talked. There was words that came from this jaw. And so the jawbone can't really go away 150 years later. It's still there. And it's there to facilitate another miracle. Just like the talking donkey in Balaam and Numbers, the ass jawbone is still there. And it's got another special role to play in history as the implement that's going to kill 1,000 Philistines. So the ass is repurposed and recycled as an implement for tremendous death. It's all a weird story, but the rabbis definitely didn't like the fact that this chamor, this donkey, there must be some significance to it, and that's the significance to it. So he throws it. That's a dramatic scene too, where he's done killing everybody with it, and he just tosses it, in the air. You see it. You have to have that scene in the movie where the jawbone is going in through the sky, while he's cast it off. And this is, again, at least one reason why the place is called Jawbone Hill. This is pretty significant, killing 1,000 people, which is not maybe a whole army, but it's a good chunk of an army. So how did he do it? How could he have done this? How could one person have killed 1,000 people? Well, the people who try to figure out how many people could someone kill in what way or whatever, he's on a mountain, so he can kill them one at a time as they come up the mountain. And I mean, it's not like it's not like there's 1,000 people that are all surrounding him at once. There's only a few people that can fight him at once. Look, it's clearly supposed to be miraculous. It's supposed to be something that shouldn't have happened. And yet it did happen, according to the Bible. According to the Bible, this guy, Samson, did it. And when he was done, I'm thirsty. I'm thirsty, God. Here's, after this tremendous 1 against 1,000, what happens here?
It's Miller time. And he was very thirsty and called on the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance into the hand of your servant. And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" But God split the hollow place that was in Lehi, and water came out. And when he had drunk, his spirit was restored, and he revived. Therefore, he called the name of it En Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day.
Yes. So we got another place. We have something else to look at. The next time you're in Lehi, in Ramat Lehi, or in the tribe of Judah, in that area, there's a couple sites we can take you by. And you can have a drink out of the spring, out of the well of the calling, Ein Hakore. I called out and I got water. So this is a explanation for how this place began to be called the well of calling, the spring of calling. So this is a natural spring. It's not a well that someone dug out. It's a natural ein. It's a spring, and it's another place. It's another place that you can see. According to this day, you can still go to Ein Hakore. So it's at Lehi. It's in this area. Do we know for sure where it is? Well, there are statues and markings where this. Some people believe this happened. It's an interesting kind of recognition that for all the strength Samson had, he still was a man. He still needed to have water. He still was somewhat dependent on God. He recognizes that God is kind of behind what he's doing. Because when he says to God, I'm doing what you wanted me to do. I'm doing this great deliverance, but now I'm going to die of thirst. And then I fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. By the way, we love the way Samson refers to the Philistines as the uncircumcised. Folks, the sexual elements to this are never far away. The Philistines, he doesn't call them Philistines. He calls them uncircumcised. Those with, by the way, the word is actually better in Hebrew. It's the guys with the foreskins. I mean, we use the word uncircumcised because that's the word, the only way we can do it in one word. But the word in Hebrew essentially is the foreskin guys, the foreskins. That's really what it is. It actually could be, I fall into the hands of the foreskins.
It's like a football team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go for
Shirts to no shirt.
No, I'm just trying not to imagine the mascot for the football team.
But where was the drive to name these different places? Was it sort of a tribute to God, or was it sort of an ego thing? It's, hey, I threw him that jawbone here.
A really common type of folk story,
Yeah.
where the hero has a bunch of adventures and every adventure ends with, and that's why this place is called so-and-so.
Yeah. And we've had this already. I mean, we've had the naming of places all the way back to Abraham, right? The first Israelite, the first Jew, starts naming places, springs, tree, orchards, places where the trees are. They have names. And of course, Jacob will name places that become shrines. So this is a big deal. The interesting thing about it in Judges, starting in Joshua, really, and going through Judges, is the places become battle sites too. And we still have those. I mean, some of the most hallowed places in the United States, if you think about it, are places that were battle sites. And whether it's Bunker Hill or Gettysburg, people go to these places. I mean, I've been to Gettysburg a few times. It's one of those things that, like, if you're in that part of Pennsylvania, you almost have an obligation. I mean, I'm speaking out of turn, but you almost have an obligation to go there. If you're driving from Philadelphia to DC, it's one of the ways to go. And it's not the convenient way to go, but it's a way to go. And people go there by the millions to be at this place. Usually they're places of victory, but Gettysburg was definitely not just a place of victory, but a place of kind of, because of the speech and because of the recognition of, like, how close it came, and how it was terrible for everybody. That's maybe a little different, but we have sites to this day that are like that are hallowed because they were places essentially of death, of this a terrible battle happening. Most people, when they go to Israel, when we take tours, we very rarely do that. The interesting thing about Jewish tours to Israel is we generally don't go to these places. We don't go to Ramat Lehi to see where Samson fought. We don't go to Jericho. Sometimes people do, to see the battle, but very rarely. we don't go, very few Jewish groups go to the sites that we're about to read about in the story of David, David and Goliath, places like that. We very rarely go to those places. It's interesting that those sites are very frequently part of Christian tours to Israel. And I'm not talking about just places where Jesus lived. They will go to sites where David or Samson or some of these biblical heroes fought. It's not usually part of the Jewish tours. I don't know if there's like one reason why, but those sites aren't there. If there are any battle sites that are on Jewish tours today, they tend to be sites of the modern Israel, the battles in modern Israel, whether it's Battle of Latrun and some of the areas where the War of Independence was fought, where the doctors and nurses were killed as they were trying to bring in medical care. It's in the movies, some of the movies depict these things, or the Valley of Tears, where during the 73 war, where there was a horrible tank battles and where a lot of Israelis were killed against the Syrians, just turned into a Netflix documentary miniseries. No, it wasn't documentary, it was a miniseries drama of the Valley of Tears. The places oftentimes are modern Israeli places of battle, and almost always, my friends, it's almost always places where something bad happened, rather where here was a great victory and the Jewish people won here. Very rarely will be those that will be on Jewish sites will say there was a tremendous battle, where the Jews beat back the Jordanians, or where this battle happened against the Egyptians. Very rarely will those sites be they won't be glorified. They really aren't. And I think it's kind of reflects a uncomfortability that the Jewish people still have with fighting and with warfare and with any type of action where people were killed and we walked out the victors. There's almost like we're okay with it if it's a place where we died, where people were martyred, but we don't feel comfortable with it if it's a place where it went on the other side. It's very strange. I can only tell you that that's just a reality. I don't know if I can get much more into it now, but and I don't have an answer.
Could it go back to Moses? Remember, what was it? They crossed the Red Sea and somebody was cheering, or what was it? It was one of those that they were cheering and God said, "No, those are my people that have died too." Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's a midrash.
Yeah, there is that idea. There is that idea that we don't.
Yeah, the Egyptians killed as well, and that was not good.
Yeah. And I think that is definitely part of our mentality, and I do think that's part of it. We don't glorify battles, and again, it becomes more of recognition of loss rather than celebration of victory.
Right, because all life is sacred. Even our enemy is sacred.
Yeah.
When we look at our martyrs, we want to remember them.
I think it's part of our psychology. I mean, look, I think, look, we're still in the early days. This is still the first 75, not even 75 years of Israel's existence. Israel is going to develop and figure these things out over time as history unfolds. It takes time. But, at some point you also have to deal with the fact that there's a cost of war on the other side too, that we have to take a responsibility for, the same way that United States has started to, commemorate and remember places where Native Americans were slaughtered, that there's going to eventually be some type of that in Israel as well. but we're still in the midst of this history unfolding, and to some extent it's a luxury, I would say, of the victors to step back and go, and also of a certain level of safety. I mean, we can I was only thinking about this because I was helping my daughter with her American history assignments, some of which, had to deal with pioneers and the discussions that they have in history today over what kind of recognition we have towards the early American settlers over Louisiana, all these stories today. And again, partly it's easy for us to do that when we're not fighting wars and essentially it's already been decided who won the battle between the cowboys and Indians.
You're the victor.
It's I don't know what's going to happen, but I do think it needs to be part of the discussion. I mean, I think it helps shape history too, to understand that, like, you don't want to have, Israel doesn't want to have places where they have to say, hey, by the way, this is where we massacred all these Palestinians. They don't want, Israel doesn't want to have that 100 years from now, and to have to take their kids around to places and say, this is where this happened, this is where this happened, and it's all, that it's bad. So this is an important discussion, and it's a discussion that Israel has to have internally, but there is that feeling about it. It all comes again, it goes back to the Bible. I mean, it goes back to the way you read the Bible, and whether you're going to say, hey, look, this place where Samson killed 1,000 people, is this something that, like, for to some extent, we look at it now, there are no more Philistines, so we don't go, hey, look at look at where we killed 1,000 Philistines. Hey, haha, Philistines, we killed 1,000 of you here. We never say that. We never say, hey, this is but at the same time, we don't celebrate it. We don't say, hey, let's think that this is the way we're supposed to respond. On the other hand, again, this is the Bible.
Don't you think our tradition is one of where we think that our heroes are scholars, are people that think Rambam, Maimonides, maybe but our heroes aren't necessarily warriors. I mean, we have some warriors here.
There's no doubt, and that is why when people traditionally went to Israel on pilgrimages 100 years ago, even to this day, when Jews go to Israel, they generally go, if they're going to go to a pilgrimage site, they're not going to go to where Samson did these kinds of things, and we'll get to the other parts of Samson's life. They go to where the Rambam is buried. They go to where Rabbi Meir was buried. They go to where Rabbi Eliezer was buried. If they go to any place that's a place, they will, as a pilgrimage site, they will go to these places. So there's no question that is part of consciousness of how, what do we recognize, rather whether it's warriors or and again, it's not even kings. If we knew, we actually kind of do know where King Herod is buried, we're not going to go to King Herod's grave and go, hey, look at the wonderful King Herod, we're gonna say some prayers at King Herod's grave. It ain't gonna happen. So even if we knew where King David was buried, it would be problematic, because people would say, are we glorifying a killer, a philanderer, a murderer? People would feel uncomfortable with it in some cases. So, I don't know. We definitely, I will tell you, keep that in mind when you finish the story. Yeah.
I'm reminded when my son had to do Seth had to do something for the Middle Ages, and the teacher's assignment had been to study the Holy Grail. And I was, I thought, no, that's not our tradition, So I had him do Maimonides, with the same time. Our tradition is more of one of scholars than, if not necessarily the Holy Grail and knights and battle and.
Yeah, I do. But listen, I do think it does have a little to say with what our values are and what are we going to celebrate. Are we going to celebrate people who are killers. And again, the greatest Jewish generals out of the last 70 years of Israel's history were really not celebrated for their military victories. I mean, to some extent they were, but really it was whether they were able to achieve peace. And so, Moshe Dayan wanted to be remembered for his work as foreign minister and as working with Arab countries to try to end the hostilities. The same thing goes for Ehud Barak, who was part of the Sayeret Maktal, who's one of the great Jewish soldiers of the last 50 years, led a lot of really daring, bold raids, to take out terrorist cells and things like that in Lebanon. But he wanted to be known as the guy who brought peace and tried to work out a peace deal. And even Ariel Sharon, people forget the guy who got Israel out of Gaza, the Israeli prime minister who took Israel out of Gaza, literally took Israeli citizens, dragged them by force out of Gaza in the 2000s, was Ariel Sharon. He was the prime minister who many people consider also Israel's greatest general, greatest military mind in 67 and was responsible for some of the greatest Israeli victories. He also wanted to be known as a person who brought lasting peace. So I will tell you, and again, people in the Arab world hated Ariel Sharon. I mean, the Palestinians hated Ariel Sharon, but they also recognized that he's the one who turned over Gaza essentially to the Palestinians. I mean, not essentially, he didn't work out the way he wanted it to, but he did do it. So it is interesting that our generals don't want to be remembered for their military victories, but for whether they really brought peace. So after
look how uncomfortable we are with the whole book of Joshua. That they killed this 10 and this. It makes us very uncomfortable to go through and read that.
It is true. It is true. So the story of Samson could have ended here. Yeah.
Just back up a little bit. When he was very thirsty and called on the Lord and said, this very liberal or loose translation that I have says, now he was suddenly thirsty and he called out to God, which is very different. Calling out God sounds like, you come over here and do something. That's calling out rather than calling on God.
Well, it's interesting. It does say both. It says he called out to God. He called out God, and he said. So, I mean, he does do both. So I think at some point he doesn't just call on God and say, but he does call on the Lord. He does call out to the Lord, and he didn't just say. He didn't just say to God, hey, you've given great deliverance. Now I'm going to die of thirst. There does, but I will do, no matter what, whether you're going to translate call on versus call out God, however you're going to translate that, there is this understanding here, without a doubt, because of what the text actually says. God, I just did this great miracle. Now you're going to have me die of thirst. So there is this sense that he is calling out God to some extent, no matter what, by saying, look, I just killed all these people and now I'm going to die of thirst. So come up with a solution for my thirst, God. It's not like, you know what, I'm going to go down and now have some water, or I'm going to go back and find some water. It's like, God, give me water now. So there is this sense like, God, you better keep providing me the stuff. So there does seem to be this demand, if you will, of God, give me water. Not, I just want to have some water, God, help me find some water. It is, and it's like, why does he even do that? Just go get a drink. Clearly they wanted us to know that this place that's called the Spring of Calling was named such because he called out to God. That's what the word koreh means. So he calls, the word calling out to God is here, vayikra, and then it is karashama, and then it is ein hakoreh. So every one of those times you see the word kara, it is the place of calling. It's where he called out God. He called out God. And again, God responded. I mean, it would be one thing if God didn't respond and wouldn't have probably this story, but it does say that he that he did. What's interesting, by the way, and I will point, I didn't really notice this before, it's the Spirit of God that animates him. It's right. It says right here, the Spirit of the Lord, it says Ruach Adonai came upon him. And here it's Vetihiena, mightily upon him, but came upon him. And then here, after he drinks the water, notice what he says. It says Rucho, Vatashav Rucho, that his spirit was restored. I never noticed that before. That when he's fighting with God, it's almost like his own spirit left him, but then his spirit was restored. So it's almost when he's filled with the Holy Spirit that it's not even him at that moment. I never noticed that before. Does everybody see that his spirit was restored? The word
Right.
tashav doesn't just mean restored, it means return, like the word teshuva, right? Tashav means came back, that his spirit came back. And then it says, and he vayechi, and then he was revived and he lived. But it's almost as if when he's fighting like that, his body it's not his anymore. It's not really under his control. Like it's almost as if when he says to God, as Reverend Lynn says, God, do something. It's almost like, you turned me into the Incredible Hulk right now. I got to drink. I got to, you've turned my body into something else. Help me get back to normal. I am still human. It's almost like I'm still a human being. I can't live like this. Right. And so when he does get his energy back, when his spirit is restored, then he can live. And it says, and he revived. So I never noticed that before, that it literally is like he's at a level where he's like so animated, he's so juiced up that he almost can't live at that moment.
Is ruach, is that ever translated as breath or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's also breath, right? Ruach is breath or spirit or can even be wind. It is the animating breath of life. Yeah, the animating breath of life. It's different from blood, which is also an animator, but ruach is definitely part of the breath and the life vital force. It's what God breathes into Adam at the beginning. So this is the animating air of life, and he doesn't have it until again his spirit comes back and he lives. So I never noticed
almost like a possession.
Exactly. And so when he gets his life back, when he's back to normal. All right. And now, again, this really weird line after this battle, if you will, is it says,
and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years.
So he had 20 years after this, supposedly, where things were, if they weren't back to normal, the Philistines maybe were still in charge, because it says the days of the Philistines, but he's in charge. So even though he was almost turned over, or he was turned over, he was almost his own people turn him over. He comes back and judges them for 20 years, which is a significant period of time. That means 20 years pass from his going crazy against them to were they somewhat peaceful? Did the Philistines leave them alone for 20 years? But that's what it says. He's a judge for 20 years, which is a significant time. And now we're going to read the conclusion of this story, folks. And this is the part that everybody remembers, but it's really a fraction of the story. This is a fraction of the tale. I mean, we've read 13, 14, and 15, and now we get to 16, and this is the conclusion of the tale. Let's read it.
Then Samson.
By the way, this is almost where most of the stories begin. So, I mean, not the begin, but this is kind of this is the part that people know. Okay, here we go.
Then Samson went to Azah and saw there a harlot and went into her. And it was told the Azah team, saying, Samson has come here. And they surrounded him and lay wait for him all night in the gate of the city and were quiet all the night, saying, in the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him.
Wow. So Samson goes to a prostitute, and that's what it says. He shazona. This is a prostitute. This isn't whatever. This isn't a wife. This isn't a concubine. This is a prostitute, and he shazona. She's in Gaza, which is one of the main, it's translated here as Gaza, but it's Gaza. It's the word, it's the Hebrew word for Gaza. he goes into Gaza to have a prostitute. Now, this is where a lot of people say that Samson is when I've read the more modern commentaries on this, that this is Samson the sex addict. Now, I will tell you, I get where they're going with this. I understand why they say it. I'm not sure that he's a sex addict. It's definitely a weakness for him. It doesn't say what he's been doing for the last 20 years, but I will tell you this. If he's not married, which we never hear of him getting married again, the last time he had sex that we know about was with his wife 20 years before. Now, the assumption why he's a sex addict is that he went to a prostitute. And this provides now another chance for him to be attacked. So assumedly, the point of people saying this today is that his sex addiction is his downfall. It's definitely a weakness, maybe. It's maybe where this is his way of kind of being both a victim and victimizer. But I'm not sure he's a sex addict. I mean, it's difficult to say that the man who we haven't heard of having sex for 20 years now sleeps with a prostitute and is now a sex addict. So I think that people kind of want to tell this story in a way that is comfortable for them or maybe fits their way of telling the story, but I don't know that he is. I don't know that he's not, but I don't know that you can claim that because he went to a prostitute after 20 years of assumedly not, I mean, we don't know that he had sex. We don't know what he did, that this does not make him a sex addict by definition. So I do feel that that's not necessarily the way he should be portrayed. And it also kind of oversimplifies and makes it seem like, oh, just the guy ran around and did this crazy sex stuff, which is why he keeps getting into trouble. You could also say every time he has sex, he gets into trouble, but that's different from saying he's a sex addict. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, like, yeah. I'm telling you, I just saw this midrash. Obviously, I was doing some reading about what we're going to talk about, and I don't know that that's a fair. I will tell you that most of these places that have said that Samson's a sex addict, I'm reading the places that come up when I just put it up there. Pure Life Ministries, Full Gospel Bible Camp, The Truth About Recovery, Christian Training Online, Project Samson, Recovering Sex Addicts, talk about the Samson Society.
Gag, choke.
Samson, How God Used a Womanizer, from Gospel Musings. Look, the rabbis didn't feel comfortable with Samson's sexual behavior either. But
it's more like it. I mean, you could just say it's adventurism and not.
I guess
not addiction.
I guess,
yeah.
But one of the things that really struck me about it when I thought about it when I was reading this, I don't know that I felt like I had to be defensive for Samson, but all of a sudden, like, I grew up thinking Samson's a sex addict, or at least sexually adventurous. I don't know that he was, because again, he seems to have a predilection for women who are going to get him in trouble. But that's far different than saying he's a sex addict, because all we know of is he has 4 relationships that none of them go right. Well, it's a far cry from saying he's a sex addict. That's all I'm saying. Is if you're looking for a sex addict, King David is a much better example of a sex addict than Samson.
I always thought of him more as a guy who couldn't say no, or at least couldn't say no and make it stick.
Maybe, but I think it's more that he's attracted to the wrong kinds of women, or that you can make the argument he uses this weird. Now I'm going to give you a new midrash, which I do think there's a basis for, folks, that Samson, as a Jewish victim of the Philistines, uses his sexuality in a weird way, where the women that he is having relationships with are Philistines, and that allows him to actually take down the Philistines. So in a weird way, he actually reverses. And again, everyone's going to say, well, this is a modern midrash, No, what he actually does is he uses his sexuality in a way. I've come to think and this was brought up by you in the beginning, that he actually uses his sexuality the way a woman usually uses her sexuality to seduce and destroy from the inside the enemy. And usually it's the woman who seduces and somehow sends out information, or as we saw in the story of Yael and then Judith, that actually like kill the enemy. But here it's the man who actually uses sexuality and his lower status to kind of actually undo the Philistines. And I've come to see this story a little differently as I've read it, and as I've kind of identify that there are interesting flips that maybe we're only starting to understand now, or being honest about now, in a time where we now are finally having maybe men, as women have been more comfortable come forward with their Me Too stories, that there are now men that are coming forward with their stories and don't feel, again, as as embarrassed about talking about how this has happened. Well,
How do we know? he was
Is there
celibate?
a sexual element to being a Nazarite? Or a non-sexual element?
interesting question, because that the rabbis feel that there was, right? The rabbis kind of feel like maybe Nazarites also, even though it doesn't say it, were also celibate during their Nazarite
Right.
period. So if that's the case, and that could have been the case, at least it was imagined the case, that yes, Samson is violating his Nazarite status every time he goes and sleeps with somebody. But it also doesn't seem quite fair in the sense that he never asked for this. Nobody asked him whether he wanted to be a Nazarite. Nobody, he wasn't his choice. He didn't say, yeah, from now on, I'm a Nazarite. He didn't do that. So what really are his parents? Did his parents make a pact with the angel of God at the beginning and say, yeah, our son's going to be celibate for his whole life? But there does seem to be some element of at least sexual behavior that should be not going to prostitutes if he's a Nazarite.
How do we know that
Is
he's
it the behavior
celibate?
of a judge to go to a prostitute? But Judah went to a prostitute. I mean, Judah went to a prostitute. The spies didn't say they went there to have sex with a prostitute, but they go to Rahab's house and they have a prostitute. We read about Jephthah's mother. She was a prostitute. It's not quite as, as clear cut that, oh, it's just bad. But yes, okay. One line, he's a judge, and the next minute he's going to harlot. Yeah. Somebody else had something to say. Don, were you saying something?
No, the question I had was, how do we know he was celibate for that past 20 years? I mean, was this?
We don't. We don't. I didn't say we know he was, but we don't know that he wasn't. I mean, we don't know what he did. But to say that he's a sex addict because he goes to a prostitute 20 years after he had sex with his wife, maybe the last time, it's hard to say that he's a sex addict.
It sounds crazy. I mean, if it was all along and then he decided, oh, wow, I just got to get it whenever. And then he get the prostitute in addition to what he's doing, then I'd say, yeah, maybe he needs a little treatment. Session, but
I will tell you that look, it doesn't seem to be like the normal kind of behavior. Like if he was having a normal sex life at home, then he wouldn't be going. But we don't know that he had it. We don't know he was married. It doesn't say he was married ever. And there also is this kind of sense of, was this the type of behavior that men, engaged in those days without there being the same feelings about it that we would have today? We don't know. I don't know. I don't think this was seen as good behavior, but on the other hand, it does lead him now to be able to do this, which is the people of Gaza surround him. And here's what happens. They say, we're going to kill him. So we're going to kill him.
And Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of the hill that is before Hebron.
Okay, so that's a little story that people oftentimes forget, that Samson literally took the gates of Gaza on his back and took them away. He literally carried them away. They were going to kill him, he knows, and he just leaves and he takes the city's walls with him. The city's not walls, but their city's doors. They literally he took away their ability to defend themselves, which is literally like another humiliating scene. They were going to kill him. He wakes up early and gets up and tears them off. So it's like, it just gives him another opportunity to humiliate the Philistines. And so it's another little story. It's a 3-verse another little story of Samson. And now we meet his final love.
And it came to pass afterwards that he loved a woman in the Wadi of Sorek, whose name was Delilah.
Okay, pause right there. So we don't know how long afterwards. I will tell you, the Bible says right away that he loved her. By Yahav, he loved her. He loved her. She lived by the Wadi of Sorek, which is an area that she lived. The rabbis want to know who she was. They don't like the fact that we don't know anything about Delilah. Was Delilah an Israelite? Was she Philistine? We don't know. The presumption always is that she's a Philistine. It doesn't say she's a Philistine. Exactly. We don't know. We don't know anything about her. As I told you, there's a midrash that she was the Philistine from the very beginning, the sister of the woman who we never hear her name, the first wife of Samson, Samson's first wife, the daughter of Timnah, the Timnite. His name's not Timnah, he's a Timnite. It's his people. It's the city he's from. How do we know she had a sister? Because the Bible said she had a sister. The Bible threw out there when the father says, hey, take her sister. She's much prettier than her anyways. Remember? Take my other daughter, which we've seen before, that same motif. It doesn't say what happens to her, folks. It never said she died. It says that the wife and her father got burned. It doesn't say the sister got burned. So what if this sister becomes Delilah? Wow. Think about that one. Think about the weird complexities and psychological craziness of that. Does she try to get him? Does she lure him? Does he know that she's the sister? All those kinds of things can go into that story. But Delilah, we don't know about her. We don't know what her story really is. But we know that he loves her. No, we know that. It's not just sex, if you will. Okay.
And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see in what his great strength lies, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him and torture him, and we will give you, every one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. And Delilah.
Hold it a second. So it says right here, the Philistines come to her and say, find out how he has the strength, how we can beat him, how we can bind him, how we can get him, and then we will bind him and torture him. So she knows right away why they want. I mean, like, there's no question that once she decides to go along with them, she knows what's going to happen to him, right? She knows. It's not like they just say, help us catch him. We won't hurt him. There's none of that. We're going to get him. Help us get him, right? Help us get him. And we will give you, each one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. So that, from the face of it, seems like it's even more than 1,100 pieces of silver. Like each one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver, right? It's a lot of money. Again, we assume that she was a Philistine lady. And what happens here in this scene?
And Delilah said to Samson, tell me, I pray you, in what your great strength lies, and with what you might be bound and tortured. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that were never dried, then shall I be weak and be as another man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now there were men lying in wait, abiding with her in the chamber. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. and he broke the bowstrings as a thread of tow is broken when it touches the fire. So his strength was not known.
Wow. So scene number one of Samson giving up the information, she asks him, how can you be caught? How? And she actually says to him, how will you be bound and tortured? He doesn't just say, how do we catch you? You know, how could someone ever take away your strength? How could you? She literally says to him, how could you be bound and tortured? Like if someone was going to bind and torture you, how could they do it? Which, by the way, that can kind of give away what she's trying to do. And he seems to get it. You think he got it the first time when there's 7 bows, when she ties them up and he breaks them. He literally is going to.
I mean, obviously he doesn't trust her or he wouldn't have lied.
Correct.
That's kind of weird.
It's a very weird scene in a lot of ways, because again, it's not just, she says to him, how can anyone tie you up? Like normally, if you're trying to prod someone for the information, you don't tell them why you want the information exactly, to tell you exactly, tell me how we're going to do, how can we destroy you? You usually don't say it that boldly, you just say, what's the secret to your strength? Or how could someone ever tie you up? I mean, that's kind of the way you'd say it, not just, and how can they also hurt you? And the interesting thing is the word anotecha, with the word they use for torture, is also the word to be subdued. How can you be subdued? Which it is also causing someone pain, but it's also being sapped of strength, or almost disabled, not necessarily tortured, but it could be. But it could also be, how does someone render you without strength? So does it the first time, doesn't do anything. At that point, a normal person would say, Delilah, why did you do that? Why are you trying to? He doesn't do it, right? He doesn't do it. And what does she say to him?
And Delilah said to Samson, behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray you, with what you might be bound. And he said to her, if they bind me fast with new ropes that have never been used for work, then shall I be weak and be as another man. Delilah therefore took new ropes and bound him with them, and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And there were liars in wait abiding in the chamber, and he broke them from off his arms like string.
So round 2. Now it's new ropes. So a second time, she pulls the same thing. And
it's kind of like Lucy with the football.
yeah. How many times are you going to? How many
Because
times?
you're going to fall for this.
And so it is really a weird. It's really a weird scene, because it's now 2 times that that she plays this game. And now, what does she say the second time?
And Delilah said to Samson, hitherto you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me with what you might be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web of the loom. And she fastened it with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he woke out of his sleep and went away with the pin of the loom and with the web.
So now we've had the third time, and the third time gets a little closer to the truth, right? Now it's, if you weave my hair, he's given away, he's gotten real close. Now, normally in a story, like the third time's the charm, right? The third time is, you only need three, right? The rule of three is like, the third time, this is where the story ends. Not in this story. It goes an extra level, which is really kind of an interesting, because that the normal thing, even and in the Bible, it's the third time, it's like the third time, that's when it's supposed to be over. It's not. And again, now in this time, she doesn't say, how can you be tortured, but how can you be bound? But now what does she say to him after the third time?
And she said to him, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me in what your great strength lies. And it came to pass, when she harassed him daily with her words and urged him so that he was sick to death, that he told her all his heart and said to her, there has not come a razor upon my head, for I have been a Nazir to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man.
Right. Now, when he finally gives in,
she finally nags him to death.
And that's what it says. He's literally like, his soul was dead. He was done after she nagged him to death, which is, again, there's supposed to be some kind of, power in this, which is that the power that he has over him doesn't seem to be from sex, but from her words. And that's what it says. It harassed him with her words. It's a pretty powerful phrase. It's a Hebrew phrase, but it's a pretty powerful one, that she harassed him with her words. And then interestingly, it says here that he told her his heart. Vayagedla et kol libo. He kind of bore his soul, right? He tells her his heart. Doesn't tell her his secret, but that's the word. Et kol libo is kind of like his innermost secret. And he tells her that. He tells her the truth, finally. And he says, without it, I'm as strong as any man, which again seems to imply that he looks like any man. It's only because of his hair that the strength goes into his body, that by fulfilling that prophecy of his birth and his commandment from birth, that he's supposed to be a Nazarite, that because he's done that, because they've upheld that covenant, that he's had this strength. So that's why. It's why this happens. Now, when we read this scene, watch what happens.
And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up this once, for he has shown me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought money in their hand. And she made him sleep upon her knees. And she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head. And she began to torment him, and his strength went from him.
Yeah. Does anybody, so she calls for the Philistines, says, hey, I know what the secret is. She makes him sleep on her knees. That's a pretty prone position for her, but also, again, look what happens to him here, right? Now, does anyone have a different translation for she began to torment him and his strength went from him? Does anybody have a different translation there for that? Nope. Verse 19. I looked it up. I looked up different translations of it. I didn't see any translation that really conveys this. But the word anah in Hebrew, anoto, when it says that she tormented him, that root anah, does anybody know what also it could be? It's at least a play on, I believe. I believe it's a play on sex, play on the word for sex. Anoto can oftentimes mean forced sex, rape. But what I think was interesting about this is that it says that after she's done doing whatever she was doing to him, he had no strength afterwards. So it's not just that she had his hair cut, but that what she does to him causes his strength to leave him. So everybody sees that, right? Everybody sees that this is what happens when she's done with him. When she's done with him, he doesn't have any strength. But it's not just the hair being cut. It says she began to torment him. So whatever she did to him, whether it was tormenting him, raping him, the word anah oftentimes has a connotation of forced sex. It also doesn't necessarily have to be forced sex. It could just be sex. It's not the only word we have for sex, but it's one of the words we have for sex in the Bible. The word that a lot of people know is the word yada, which means to know. But knowing somebody seems to be a little less violent or less strong as this word anah. So I found it interesting that the word here could also mean, or at least a play off of the word for rape. All right, so what happens now that strength is actually gone from him?
And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke up out of his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times before and shake myself." And he knew not that the Lord was departed from him. But the Philistines took him and bored out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass. And he ground at the mill in the prison house.
Wow, that's a quick flip, right? God, and by the way, the fact that he doesn't know that God isn't, there's the word yada, that God is not, he doesn't know that God was not with him anymore. And it's the same root departed from him is.
And he doesn't seem to know that Delilah was torturing him either.
Correct.
Which
Which is why I don't think it's torture. I think what she did to him was literally sap his energy. And so was this a way for him to lose his energy? Was that sexual act, once his strength had been taken from him, was that what caused him to eventually be weakened to the point where now the Philistines are on them and they're gone and they bore out his eyes? So, and that's the word. They took out his eyes. They dug out his eyes. They didn't just blind him. They took out his eyes. They gouged out his eyes. Which to physically assault somebody like that is another form of it's a horrible form of torture, and also, but maybe again, to defile somebody this way. All right. They took him down to Gaza, bound with fetters.
But the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaved. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hand."
Yep. Now, we already know, the Bible's already told us, his hair's starting to grow. So this is a little bit of foreshadowing. His hair's coming back. And now the Philistines are not just celebrating the fact that Samson's been delivered to them, but that their God's the best. Our God, the God, is the God who's the one in charge. Just look at this. Samson, their great, our great enemy, this great liberator, is now in our hands. It's Dagon that did it.
And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has delivered into our hands our enemy and the destroyer of our country, and one who slew many of us. And it came to pass when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson that he may make sport for us. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made sport for them, and they set him between the pillars.
Yeah. And so again, this is the word Yitzchak, right? They are going to, they played with him. Could there have been a sexual element to this as well? It's possible, because at least in other places, the rabbis seem to take away the idea that this is not just playing around for fun or for play of sport, but that this is actually maybe sexual humiliation as well. So they brought him into.
Why would they? Why? What is the point of that? Like, of the rabbis saying that it's sexual torture?
They didn't say it here. I'm telling you that they have no issue calling it the word tzachek in other places, especially like where Abraham is playing with Sarah, for that to be a possibility. And they also say that when Ishmael is playing with Isaac, that there is a possibility. The rabbis were saying that he was molesting Isaac, that Ishmael was molesting Isaac. So they have no issue sometimes saying the word tzachek is not that. Again, it could just be that they made him dance around like an idiot. He's blind and he can't see, and they push him around and they prod him and they're making fun of him. Also could be sexual, though. It is possible. That look, they have other places where there's other places where it's clearly a double entendre, and it could be here too. But the point is that here he is. They took him out of the prison house and they bring him into their party house. They're bringing him into the place where they're having a party. They're having fun. So they brought him out for this special occasion to humiliate him, this Jewish hero. And this is what they did. And again, look, when it says that they placed him between the pillars, we know where the story's going, but the story is building up to this. The fact that, again, this guy's already pulled down. We've already seen him pull down gates. Everything in this story has been, there's a precedent for it. We have foreshadowing. We've already seen Samson taken captive. We saw the Israelites taking him captive. We've seen women betraying him. We've seen him at risk after laying with a woman. I mean, all of these things have already happened. Nothing in this story, we've already been there. So by the time we see this happening, we've already seen Samson in that same exact place. That's the power of the story, is that this isn't just about a guy who makes mistakes. He's already made the mistake. He's made the mistake already. He's already done it. There's nothing new here. This guy's already been down that road. So here he is at the pillars.
And Samson said to the lad that led him by the hand, leave me alone and let me feel the pillars on which the house is fixed, that I may lean upon them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And there were upon the roof about 300,000 men and women, about 3,000. I don't know where the 100 came from. About 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport.
And again, this is 3,000 people in this place.
And Samson called to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray you, and strengthen me, I pray you, only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for one of my two eyes." And Samson took hold of the central pillars upon which the house stood, and he supported himself on them, on the one with his right hand, and on the other with his left.
So the scene with the pillars is very dramatic. It is really brought like these last verses with him being led to the pillars and having these pillars, one on each of his hands, and he's standing there in this position with between the pillars. And he says to God, right? He again, he doesn't just say to God, he calls on God. Vayikrashim shon. He called to the Lord. He called on the Lord. Vayikrashim shon El Adonai. It's the same phrase. So if you're gonna put Vayikrashim shon El Adonai, if you're gonna say call on, it's call to, or but you should have it the same way in both places, which is that God, he's calling on God, and he says to God, and it's really a powerful scene, which he says, look, I know what's going to happen now. And he says, God, just do it for one of my two eyes, right? They blinded me on both, which I think is an interesting phrase, right? Because it's almost as if Samson's saying, look, I can understand if they're going to take out one of my eyes, but God, what about the other one? Aren't you going to avenge me for that one? He took away everything from me. These Philistines, they didn't blind me, in one eye and just humiliate me. They made me blind, right? They took out both my eyes. So God, like if you're not going to do it, if you're not going to do it for both of my eyes, do it for one of my eyes. Do it. I'll take some responsibility for this almost. I mean, it's partly what I see in his do this. Or God, look, you could do both. Just do one. Give me enough energy for one eye. Again, all of this is I'm going to die here too. I'm done here. This is it. I don't walk away from this, which I have to now also throw out here as we watch this scene unfold and Samson's last act. This last act of someone committing suicide. Was this not Samson's goal all along? Let's read this.
And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were in it. So the dead whom he slew at his death were more than those whom he slew in his life.
Wow. So why do we have 3,000? Well, if he had 1,000 people that he killed, at Ramat Lehi, and, he killed other people from the very beginning, the first 30 that he killed. If you add up all the people that he killed, it's not 3,000, but he kills 3,000 now. He killed 3,000 people now in his death than he did in all his life. And that's a very powerful line, folks. I mean, how is that not honestly one of the most tragic lines in the Bible, which is that Samson killed more people as he died than he did during his life. It is a terribly tragic story of a tragic person in a tragic time. And the fact that he can do more damage in the end with his death than he could with his life. The whole tragedy is compounded by that. The interesting thing is in the different dramatic versions of this, almost all of them have Delilah there. There's even one version, I think maybe it was this last version in 2018, where Samson tells you somehow knows Delilah. You can't see her, knows Delilah's there. He's aware that Delilah's there, and he tells her to get out. Would he have told Delilah to get out? I mean, all of those kinds of questions we're left with here. Would he be sparing Delilah? Was Delilah there? It doesn't say she was there, but people want to kind of know.
Why would he spare her?
Because he still loves her.
Because he still loves her, even though she did this to him?
I don't know. Judith, I don't know.
That's the way people act sometimes.
People have done crazier things.
Plenty of people stay in destructive relationships.
Yeah. Okay.
But some of them will save the people that destroyed them. And that's, that it's not here. And it again, the people love in the drama that, to show that she's there with the other Philistines when this happens. But I will point out, folks, we don't know for sure she is a Philistine. I only want to tell you, like, that's the easy way to go, that she's a Philistine helping other Philistines, or that she's the sister of a Philistine who he's responsible for her death in the first place. Or she's maybe, her brother was killed by him at Lehi, or all the weird kinds of ways that she might have a motive to be part of this. But folks, what if she's an Israelite? What if Delilah was an Israelite? Her name is not Philistine. We don't have any Philistine names in this, by the way. We don't know what exactly their names would have been, but whatever they are, we don't know that Delilah is a Philistine. The fact that she's a Hebrew, an Israelite, is also an interesting, complex possibility. Now, look, it's not the way we want it, because we want her to be a Philistine. We want her to have that motivation and kind of like she's on the wrong side. And we know that he likes Philistine women, so it's easy to say. But what if she's not? It says she's by the Wadi of Sorek. Maybe that's not a Philistine, was not a Philistine. I mean, Philistines could have lived anywhere. It's possible, but it also could have been an Israelite. Now, what is that? What is that? The layers to that, if she in fact is an Israelite who turns in one of her own people. We already know the Israelites turned him in already once. So is it possible? Absolutely. And I think it actually it gives an interesting layer to this, which is one of the people who are the victims. How do they, do you hold her responsible for cooperating? Well, she's paid. So I guess you could say she's responsible because there is a payment that goes to her. But if she says, look, there's nothing else I can do, or, I mean, he's doomed anyways, or whatever her rationale is for doing what she does, we don't know what she thinks. We don't know whether she ever cared for him. We don't know whether she was motivated to destroy him in the first place, which is that she doesn't even need to get paid. She just wants him dead. There's a vengeance factor. We don't know. All of this is a possibility. Or she just did it for the money, but we don't know what happens to her. We don't know what happens to her. Let's finish up in the last moments and read this literally the last line of the story of Samson.
Then his brothers and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burying place of Manoach, his father. And he judged Israel for 20 years.
Wow. We know where he's buried. There's a place where he's buried. I mean, assumingly you could go to see Samson's burial place somewhere between Zorah and Eshtaol. He's buried in the place where his father's buried, the Kever Manoach, in the place where his father's plot. Folks, that's the last thing we read about him. He judged Israel for 20 years. We knew that. We already heard that. But, the stories all kind of have that. How long did the guy judge for? He's our judge for 20 years. Well, that's what he did. By the way, never in this story is there ever any condemnation for his suicide. He is not condemned for his suicide. Now you could say, well, it's because he takes out a lot of people. But I want to make a point here, which is that I've studied suicide in the Bible a lot. And this story is obviously one story of suicide. It's also a suicide homicide at the same time. It's a martyrdom, but it's also a murder. It's also a catastrophe, military catastrophe for the Philistines. But there's no condemnation of what he does. And he should never have done this. He committed suicide, and that's what happens. And we see in the Bible stories of people who die in battle, who choose to die essentially by their own hand, or at least have their life taken from them rather than fall into the enemies. And never is it condemned as an act of going against tradition, going against God. It's never condemned. So I will tell you, keep this in mind, because we'll read about it with King Saul. We saw with Avimelech, this weird king who was like a king for a little bit of time during the Judges, who asks to be killed so that people don't say he got killed by a woman. All of those kinds of, every time we see it in the Bible, there's never a condemnation. And again, I'm not saying the Bible encourages suicide. It doesn't. But it also doesn't condemn certain times when people have done stuff that makes us uncomfortable, but it's not condemned. Don, yeah, sorry.
You know, this final scene kind of reminds me of the Inglorious Bastards for some reason, you know, in the where they burn up the theater. But the question I actually had is, why did they put the phrase "and he judged Israel for 20 years" here? It's almost like, well, they buried him, but by the way, he was a judge. I mean, they mentioned that earlier. I just kind of wonder why they actually stated that in this
Again?
particular.
Because you
Yeah.
know, it's almost as if they say, to me, the takeaway from this is that look, we read stories in the book of Judges that are standout stories. If this, most people would say, I mean, I think unequivocally, this is the most famous story in Judges. The story of Deborah is probably the second most well-known story, but this story is, and maybe Jephthah comes third, but this story is the most well-known. It's one of the most well-known biblical stories. But essentially, the last word in this story is that, yes, indeed, he will be remembered for the fact that he was a judge. So all of his tragedy, all of his weird life, his predilections, his getting into trouble, his like, he will be remembered as a judge. The last word in this is that he judged Israel for 20 years. And again, we knew that, we were already told. It never told us, by the way, and you could argue the reason it had to say it earlier was because according to this, he did judge people. He was a judge for 20 years, and he did serve as a judge for a 20-year period. And so the Bible reminds us of that at the end by saying, look, at the end of the day, he was a judge. And for everything he did that was wrong and every way that his life came out, he was a judge. And he is buried to some extent, as a hero. His brothers came and buried him and gave him a burial fit for somebody who didn't die in shame.
Sounds like something they would just put on his, tombstone if there was one.
It
judge
sounds,
for 20
it
years.
sounds like the formula for ending judge stories.
Is it?
Well, it is. I mean, every time we read the end of right before we came into this story, we read about Jephthah and Jephthah, it tells us that, it says Yiftach judged Israel for 6 years and he died. I mean, and then it says he's buried. Like, how long he lived?
It's like a cue to the audience, like, and they
Yeah.
lived happily ever after.
And Ivzan was judged, and after him is Ivzan. I mean, it doesn't say how he died and where he's buried, but it says it does. It says he's buried in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
One of these guys, the formula is how long he lived. I mean, how long he judged, where he was from, and where he was buried. And that's the formula. So this is our formula. This one we don't. This one I don't. No, we do. Yeah. Yeah. There's one or two people that we don't know where he was, where he was buried. But these guys, for the most part, we know that's all that matters is, again, where he was from, where he judged, and where he's buried, how long judged. And so he gets this normal end to the story, which is not a normal story. It's one of the weirdest stories in the Bible. It's one of the most sexualized stories in the Bible. It's one of those stories that just oozes, if you will, sex and violence. And it is very much like a Tarantino story, because his stories usually aren't as sexual as they are violent, but this story is violent and sexual.
Game of Thrones.
And it's sexual in a way that, again, most stories in the Bible are not. So when we come back next week, we're going to read another weird story that kind of sets up to the next story, which is not as famous as the story of Samson. Like I said, there's no more famous story. But when we get into Judges chapter 19, which again, we're a couple chapters away, but we'll read it next week. When we read the story of Judges chapter 19, it's one of the weirdest stories in the entire Bible. So the story of Samson. If you don't love the story of Samson, you definitely remember the story of Samson. But the story of Judges chapter 19, most people don't know it. Most people don't realize it. We're actually going to be reading the original version, which actually probably was written at the same time or little around the same time is Genesis chapter 19, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to read the inspiration probably to the way we told the Sodom and Gomorrah story, a story that most likely really did happen during the time of the judges, and it is kind of the pinnacle of what went wrong during the time of judges. So please join us next week when we're going to read the story of.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, were the rabbis' takeaway of this story, is this what's happened when you don't adhere to a vow of God? He didn't do what a Nazarite is supposed to do. Maybe that's why they made it sexual too, that he was sleeping with women and he cut his hair. And
That's probably a good possibility that he didn't live life the way he was supposed to live. I got another possibility here too, which is not a good possibility for most of us to think about, but that this is the way he was supposed to live his life, that his fate, and he knew it, was to do exactly what he was supposed to do. And even though it was ridiculously brutal and bloody and torturous and everything else, this was what he was supposed to do. I'm not sure that he didn't die going, God, I did exactly what I was supposed to do in this world, which is even more disturbing in a way, because it means that some of us are destined to do God's will in a way that doesn't seem to be like, why would God do these kind of things? But it's at least a possibility. And I'm not.
And then where do you have free will?
I'm probably, I know. And I'm probably leaning more to that second one, other than the only thing you can make the argument is that there are possibilities along the story for the story to go a different way. And that Samson doesn't take those opportunities. That's the good way of saying it, is that maybe if the Israelites would have fought with Samson at that moment, instead of turning him over, that maybe the story would have been different. But maybe Samson knows in the back of his mind that the only way for me to inspire my people is essentially to commit suicide and kill a bunch of these Philistines, because they're never going to do it themselves. I only want to tell you that if that's the possibility, again, it's not a good possibility. It's not one that we want to celebrate. And I don't think the Bible wants us to necessarily celebrate Samson more than just to say that there are people who have a tragic place in history and they fulfill their purpose even when it's not good. And Samson's purpose seems to be to kill a lot of Philistines and to kind of almost tell you why these kinds of people are not really fully heroic. I think he almost sets the tone for the rest of Jewish history, why we don't have those kinds of superheroes, because there's a trade-off with this. If you're going to live a life where you're going to do superhuman feats and sleep with women and do these kinds of things that like allow you to have this kind of, for want of a better word, a badass type of existence, there's a penalty for it. There's a consequence to it. And it's not a good one. I don't think this is a story where you walk away going, wow, what a great guy. You walk away going, oh my gosh, at the best, he's a martyr, and he's a willing participant in his own destruction because he knows he can kill a lot of his enemies. I just don't know. I don't know whether I don't think the story was supposed to be, let's be like Samson. I don't think that was ever the purpose of it. And especially like the previous story of Jephthah, where you're kind of like, you walk away going, oh, this is horrific. What a terrible existence when the best you can hope for is to make a weird promise and have your daughter. All these stories in Judges are bad stories. There's nothing good that happens in this where you walk away going, I guess maybe the story of Deborah, but it gets progressively worse as we come to the conclusion. So yeah. I just, kind of keep that in mind.
You could look at one extreme of this and say, he had no will. He was a tool, and, he'd almost be the equivalent of what the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan.
I was just going to tell everybody that the interesting thing that is part of modern Israel and part of the history of today is that Israel does have what's called the Samson option, which a lot of people have heard of. But the Samson option is the name that military analysts have given to Israel's nuclear weapons, which is that Israel has never denied that they have nuclear weapons. They've never affirmed that they have nuclear weapons, but supposedly Israel has, anywhere from, it doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons. Supposedly Israel has weapons that would allow them to, if they felt like they were going to be wiped out, that they would take out their enemies. And we don't know whether or not that's what Israel has ever called it, but this idea that Israel's Samson option is this nuclear strategy is exactly what, Don, it's called. We don't know for sure that the Israelis referred to it as that, but there are writers, including Seymour Hersh, who say that Ben Gurion, Perez, and Dayan also all used the term Samson option when they talked about the nuclear option for Israel.
On a happier note, anybody that's planning on going to see Fiddler on the Roof on the 24th, better get their tickets. It's almost sold out.
Thank you.
I want to go, but I'm busy.
Thank you. We're not promoting it because technically it is Shabbat. So it was an ethical dilemma. And I will tell you that if you're going to take part in that, we in the past promoted the fact that Kenny would sing along. He'd be in charge of the sing along at the Lemley Theaters in Encino. But there's nothing we could do about it being on Friday. That's when it is. That's when Christmas is. So yes, we do not have a live service that night. We have a live service this Friday night. So please join us with Rick and Addie at 8:00. We're having services at 8:00 this Friday, the 17th. And then on the 19th, we have a wonderful speaker. And I will again thank Don, who's still on the line. Don, thank you for arranging. Tom Island is going to be speaking about his life, the challenges that he faced with autism and how he's turned it into a way to help others. And he has an inspiring story. He's going to be at our temple at 1:00. He'll also
And
be
his
on
mother
Zoom.
was a wonderful person.
Thank you.
His mother worked a lot in Santa Clarita with local departments, and she was great.
Emily.
She is great.
Emily? Yes. And so he did speak at our synagogue many, many years ago, probably like almost 12, 15 years ago, when he was still a young man. And now he's written a book, and now he's going to be talking. It's called Come to Life. And so please join us or watch it online with us if you're not able to be there. Hey, thank you, everybody. Don't be like Samson. Don't ever be in a situation where you have to be like Samson. And everybody stay strong, but not like Samson. Stay strong in a good way. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,